I'm planning to race the infamous DR200 in a 24-hour endurance race solo. So for those of you who have not ridden a DR200, you can't possibly imagine how bad of an idea this is. And for those of you who have ridden a DR200, you're probably just sitting there like waiting for the punchline. Like, what, is he gonna take the DR200 sticker off the DR200 and slap it on an RMZ and be like, oh, I'm riding a DR200? And honestly, nope, I'm really just that much of an idiot. There is no joke, there is no punchline. I'm straight up riding a DR200. And this is the story of how it's been unfolding so far as I prepare to reap a steady stream of KTM tears for 24 hours straight next month. So 1 year ago, I bought this 2003 DR200 SE. And I remember clearly before going to pick it up, I was looking at the specs online and just thinking, okay, 8 inches of travel front and rear, it's a 200cc 2-valve front disc brake, about 275-ish pounds ready to ride. Based on those specs, it's like a cut below like a CRF 230F. It's kind of just like a overweight cut below a CRF 230F. That's what I was thinking anyway. Then I get there and I actually ride the bike, and that's when I realized this is not even in the realm of CRF 230F. The DR200 is more like a TTR 125 that has like 100 pounds of bowling balls hanging off of it, has worse suspension, has worse brakes, has worse throttle response. Yeah, it's just, it's actually worse than a TTR 125. So it is easily, by far and away, the worst bike I've ridden that has full-size wheels. But anyway, when I bought the bike, there was a race happening the next morning. So I decided, yeah, let's see what kind of damage I can do on the worst bike I've ever ridden. So within 60 seconds of the start of that race, I had already decided, wow, this is way too sketchy. This is way too stupid. I'm never doing this again. I'm never racing a DR200 again. I'm gonna get through this one, I'm gonna put on the show, and then that's it. Like, that DR200 is gonna be total like dual sport duty, putting around. That's it. Every little irregularity in the terrain results in suspension problems. It's kind of hard to believe how much bottoming and pogoing that front end can do. I was trying to wrap my head around how it's even possible for the bike to have 8 inches of travel, yet it bottoms on every like 2-inch rock. It's literally just amazing. And besides like the absolutely nuclear bottoming explosions that happen on every hit, that front end has no feel. It is so flexy and wobbly. The front wheel just wanders wherever the hell it wants to go. I was questioning why they even put handlebars on the thing, because it doesn't care about your input. It's like, okay, we're turning this way, and the front wheel's like, nah, we're turning this way. So I couldn't very well control where I was going, but at the very least, this DR200 did have a forward propulsion mechanism, and that's kind of cool. Like, if we're talking about a machine that can propel you forward as you ride it, that is cool, because at least now we're beating out the actual literal Stone Age cavemen. But unfortunately, the DR200 during this race had a lot of problems with that forward propulsion function. So to get any decent amount of forward movement kind of took like a lot of RPM, which totally, not even joking, being fair, is very reasonable for an 199cc 4-stroke. Like, yeah, it's gonna require some RPM. But the thing was that maybe 500 to 1,000 RPM above the point where you're like, okay, I'm finally moving decently, that is where it starts to float the valves already. So there was like this fine little RPM range between snail slow and you're breaking the bike. That just isn't easy to use or maintain, especially because of the super wide ratio 5-speed transmission on that thing. So normally you have like a clutch to help you modulate the power, but this DR200 that I bought didn't come equipped with a clutch. It came equipped with what I would call a slipping mechanism that sometimes grabbed if you treated it just right. So nipping the clutch to get back into the power band out of a turn or after a shift or whatever was totally out the window. It would just like rev out freely and like liquefy the clutch even further. And even if I did have it in the power band and I just held it wide open for too long, it would just start slipping out. So that clutch was fried as hell. Then yeah, that thing also comes equipped with a BST-31 CV carburetor, which means actuating the throttle doesn't actually actuate the slide directly. It's a vacuum operated slide. And that thing felt like it had a short timer between when you would open the throttle and when it would actually like slowly, gently, carefully start to ease open the actual throttle. Sup? Oh, it's okay. So then whenever I would somehow manage to get some decent speed on this bike, one of two things would happen. Either I'd have to slow down for something, you know, like you generally have to do when you're dirt biking, and then the brakes would just not slow me down, so I'd be holding on for dear life, which is probably the only reason I did decently in that race. Or the suspension would just initiate ejection protocol and I'd crash. I did that a lot. It was seriously unfortunate that my helmet cam got killed like a quarter into the race, because during the second half of the race, I had so much drama, so much crashing, many ejections. It was awesome. And the best one was when I lost the seat of the bike.
I saw a headlight.
Oh yeah, that's him.
Are you serious?
That's him.
He pulled a wheelie.
Oh my god, another one? Look at this mad lad.
Oh, it doesn't have a seat.
So I was going as fast as that bike would go on a wide open straight, just trying to keep the guy ahead in sight, when suddenly the guy ahead just gets flicked off his bike. And before I can even think maybe I should slow down, I'm already at the same trap, and I see it's like this hidden, gnarly, sharp edge, stadium style whoop section that just randomly, naturally occurred in the middle of the desert. And at that point it was too late. All I could really do was like hold on really tight and hope that staying attached to the bike would help them find my remains. Next thing I know, front wheel is smashing into the first mound at like 45 miles per hour, which is like 44 miles per hour too fast on a DR200. And the front wheel smacked that bump so hard that it instantaneously cocked 45 degrees to the left. Handlebars still held straight, and the bike and I just launched total sideways, and somehow, thankfully, we got flicked off the side of the trail, because if I kept smashing through that whoop section, it would have been game over. Like that would have been it for me. So next thing I know, I'm on the ground, but as far as I can tell, I'm still alive. So I get up, my wrists are having that like buzzing pain. So I like move them around a little bit, just confirm they're not badly broken. Then I pick up the bike and swing a leg over it, and something is very wrong. There is no seat on the bike. So I'm like, well, that's not good. I don't want to continue without a seat because this bike isn't set up very well for standing. So I look around in my immediate area. Other riders already gotten up and taken off, and there's just nothing around me. No seat in sight. So I have no clue where that seat is. I don't know if it like is in orbit or if it's just still flying. If it simply disintegrated on contact with that first mound, I don't know. But nobody ever found that seat. The course was swept after the race. Nothing was ever found. But anyway, I ended up finishing that race somehow with what was left of the bike, ended up cleaning up the vast majority of the KTMs out there, and enjoyed a very healthy dose of KTM tears at the end of that one. Then that DR200 sat for a long time while I raced my CRF 250X and my XR250R into the ground, and I have videos on both of those. Then in May of this year, I ended up hitting like a really low spot where I just like couldn't come up with any income. I was struggling hard, mostly because of the pandemic, but also because of medical issues of my own that I was having. And I ended up having to bail on my apartment and had to get rid of like just about all of my belongings because I wasn't going to have a place of my own anymore. It was pretty sad because this year I was really looking forward to making a bunch of content for you guys, but I just couldn't afford to, and all of my bikes were broken except for this one, which only really needed a seat and a foot peg before it would technically be rideable, and that was the DR200. So I was very seriously on a tight budget, but I decided if I'm going to make any content at all, the DR200 is going to be the ticket. So I was like, okay, I'm willing to put in what it takes to make this thing functional and get it up to par to where I can make content on it, if I can get some proof from the audience that they will actually be interested in some DR200 content. And if you only ask people, of course they're gonna say like, yeah, make it, give us free content. So instead, I just put up a page on my website where people could buy parts for the DR200. It was just like cheap stuff, but it ended up being like 3 or 4 pages of parts. And I was like, okay, if like 5 people buy parts for this thing, then I know there's probably like 5,000 people that are actually going to want to watch. So I put that up, you know, expecting like a couple people to be interested in it because it's just a DR200 content. I didn't think like people would go crazy about it. But instead, these awesome people, the people who make this free content and just free internet content possible for all the rest of us, totally bought everything that I put up there for the DR200 in like a day. I was like, holy crap, okay, I definitely have to do whatever it takes to make the best DR200 content ever. So I got a seat, got a foot peg, made the DR200 rideable, and I started with just a little simple challenge just to see how capable the DR200 was. And that challenge was to complete the Mega Loop. And that was a trail that was about 125 miles, so pretty long. It goes around an entire mountain, and it has like a handful of tricky sections. Long story short, I failed miserably to make it around. But I'm kind of not too surprised, because that loop is totally cursed. I kid you not. I've tried it on several different bikes, and I've failed every time. There's always like a freak mechanical issue that happens when you try that loop. I've seen other people try it, flat tires, broken rims, like you name it. But anyway, here's how it went. First attempt, I dropped it on this little rocky climb.
Off we go! Let's not go off the cliff. Oh, we're going off the cliff.
And when I went to restart the bike, the battery went flat very quickly. And I had to bump start and go home, replaced the battery, went back out for the second attempt, crashed it again on the same climb, and this time the exact same thing happened. When I went to restart the bike, I got a few cranks and then the battery just, it was dead. So I knew something was clearly wrong, but these were actually like the final days of having my apartment, and I wasn't gonna even be living out there anymore, so I had like literally just a few days to accomplish this if I was going to accomplish it. So my friend Josiah came out and we just did it. We just set out to do it with jumper cables. But then I hit a rock and lost my engine oil.
Oh no, she just seized up.
So we only made it 6.2 miles. So I had like 2 5-mile attempts and then the two of us made it 6.2 miles. Then, when I was recovering the DR200, literally all I had to do was walk this thing like maybe 100 meters, but it was like 100 meters of slight up and down, and I was like, I don't really feel like doing the slight uphill. So I tried to take a shortcut and just coast it down this like rocky, gnarly way, which I had never been down before, and it looked kind of sketchy. And this was in the middle of the night with just a flashlight, and I ended up dropping the DR200 off a cliff, like a substantial cliff. So it crashed into the bottom, broke the instrument panel, broke the key barrel, and from then on, I had to hotwire the bike for it to turn on. But fortunately, after I had it back and I hotwired it and filled it with oil, it ran just like before, so that was very Suzuki-like of it. But still, it was time to get to wrenching on this thing and make it something worth racing. The first thing I did on this bike was tune in that front end. Simple orifice-damped non-cartridge forks like the one that come on this bike tend to get a bad rap. They don't tend to get a bad rap. They do get a very bad rap because they're non-adjustable. But in reality, there is actually a great many variables that you can play with to get them feeling good. And it really only took me like a couple of testing sessions to get those things way better, to the point where I actually think they are good. So if you've ridden a DR200, you're probably thinking, wait, front end, good? Just simple tuning and it's good? And I completely agree with not believing that, because just based on how bad the front forks are, bone stock, you would never think that just changing a few variables will make them actually good. So if you don't believe me, I don't blame you. And I know there's one person watching right now who's like, please go into details, tell me exactly what you did, every little thing. That person, that one person, needs to subscribe and turn on notifications, because I've got something coming for that one person. The truth is, I can't do that on this type of video, because as soon as I get even a little bit too technical, I lose all the audience. For the front brake, I just did like a very typical service, just pads and fluid. And that got the front brake working as it should. It had like a firm feel and good response, but it still wasn't like all that powerful. And I think the truth is that single piston caliper on that smaller than normal sized rotor just isn't going to feel powerful on a 275 pound bike. But I didn't try to modify it or anything further, because I still was going to make that bike way lighter. So yeah, I went around the bike, pulled off weight that I wasn't going to need, straightened things out, and replaced the front wheel bearings because they were super notchy. I pulled the entire PWK carburetor setup from my CRF 230F because that thing was in a state of total disrepair, and I just slapped it right onto the DR. Because if I was going to race this thing, I did not want any of that disconnected feel that you get with a CV carburetor. And this PWK carburetor on that DR200 absolutely did not disappoint. With that carburetor setup and a modified exhaust, that bike was completely transformed. It went from lazy throttle response, slow pickup in power, slow revving, and just soft overall power, to sharp throttle response, quick pickup in RPM, and really decent power that really just ramps up in the mid-range to what I can only describe as like excellent power for a 200cc little 2-valve thing. And it just carried that power all the way until, of course, the valves float. And of course that carburetor required some tuning. I had to ride it a few times to get it dialed in. It didn't work straight away with the same settings that worked on the CRF 230F. But all of the time that I spent on that carb swap, which honestly wasn't all that much, was absolutely worth it, because it just totally changes the way that 200 feels. It revealed to me that Suzuki actually gives you like a decently hot little 200 engine, and then it's just totally masked off by an eco carburetor and a freaking eco exhaust that makes it this basically like one of the mellowest, crappiest bikes you'll ever ride. But this was by far the greatest transformation I've seen doing like an uncorking or carb swapping on any bike. It made power that I felt like I can be freaking fast on. And I just decided we're going with stock internal components because that's going to help reliability during the 24-hour race. So next up, I addressed the funky scooter-like ergos on the DR200, which place the foot pegs way too far forward and make it like really difficult or impossible to ride with good form. And I did that by moving the pegs back. So we cut and welded the peg mounts in a way that put the pegs in line with the swing arm pivot, which is generally around where it should be on a dirt bike. And I found that doing that was a huge upgrade, because when the pegs are way forward in that stock position, it just wasn't gonna happen for 24 hours. That strains your back way too hard. It gives the rear wheel a ton of leverage over you, so the rear wheel like very easily swaps around and bucks. It also kind of revealed that the rear suspension isn't as bad as you might imagine. If you just move the pegs back, you generally will be able to control that rear end. Next, I addressed that god-awful freaking clutch. What I found beneath that clutch cover actually made me like laugh out loud. So when I pulled that clutch pack apart, I found that the friction discs were worn down completely flat, like the friction material gone. And of course they were just burnt black. So that clutch was toast. And actually, besides clutches that have completely exploded, that was the worst one that I've seen. So to repair that, I went with an OEM clutch pack, EBC clutch springs, and then I shimmed them for a little extra preload. And after I broke in the clutch a little bit, it ended up having a totally decent grab. I wouldn't call it like really good grab. If you put it in like third or fourth and try to clutch up a wheelie, it's still just going to give you like a little bit of a instead of a snap. But it's totally usable. I think in the dirt it's going to hold up just fine. So I'm happy with it. So I did some test riding in that exact trim right there, and I found that the major thing holding me back was the gearing, the final drive gearing. It's super tall on a super wide ratio transmission, and it was just making it so that I was having to use first gear too much and having to shift between first and second gear too much, which I really don't like to have to do on a racing setup. Totally fine for a dual sport setup, but on a racing setup, I don't want to be going between first and second gear ever if I can avoid it, because that's like the most prone to getting you an accidental neutral. So I ended up going down to a 13-tooth front sprocket and just retaining the original rear sprocket, and that pretty much gets me to the point where I don't really have to use first gear. And during that testing, I finally discovered why the bike was cooking batteries. Like every time I would put in a new battery, I would get a couple starts out of it, and then that battery would be totally broken, just cooked. And that was because the starter was shorted internally. It was shorted internally along with like some cracked magnets in there. So it was totally toast. And I'm glad that was the issue instead of having to hunt down like some wiring issue or something like that. So all I had to do was buy another starter and just chuck that in. So that made it really easy. And finally, to be sure that my build was going to be super solid, I pulled the top end apart for a refresh and discovered why the DR200 is kind of an unbelievable ripper with just a carb swap and modded exhaust. This thing has big valves, it has big flowing ports, and a cam that is nearly maxed out in that head. And that's something that you don't see on these lower performance bikes. They're generally the opposite. They will have like the smallest, most mellow, like lowest performance components internally. So while I was in there doing a refresh, I found that the valve springs that were in there were significantly sacked out compared to new ones. And that was actually cool to see, because that meant when I threw the new ones in, I would probably end up with a higher RPM ceiling before valve float. Before assembling the fresh top end, I sent everything that could benefit from lower friction, higher wear resistance, and increased fatigue strength to WPC treatment. It was totally affordable, and the price to have an entire top end done makes it kind of a no-brainer for any endurance engine. The top end came out running freaking great, but most noticeably, it did rev higher before it reached valve float. And now I have just a little more RPM to work with. So now what I have is like a very decently performing engine for a 200cc, and I'm retained the reliability of the stock components, plus I've WPC treated everything for even more reliability. To me, it just seems like this thing is exactly what the doctor ordered for endurance racing. And that's how the bike currently stands. Front end tuned, carb swapped, ergos fixed up, and it's down to 237 pounds ready to ride compared to 275 stock. And I have to say, it's a billion times better than when I got it. After doing that minor but largely beneficial build, it was time to just start practicing for the race. So my first attempt at practicing actually was pretty damn awful. I set out to see what kind of pace I could hold for 3 hours, and I only made it 1 hour before I was in the red zone physically, and probably should have sought medical attention. Like, I was jacked up. I went home from that feeling so defeated. It was bad. Like, how the hell was I supposed to go 24 hours on that thing if I was dying after an hour? And I found that, well, it's kind of important to not base your evaluation of yourself on the first real practice ride after barely riding for 6 months, because the next practice felt a little better as the muscle memory started to bounce back, and then I put in a 2-hour practice and felt great, and then I put in a 3-hour practice and felt great, and then I did 5 hours and felt great. So here we are now. I just need to fix up a couple things on the DR200, and she'll be ready for more race prep practice, and that's all I gotta do, because I'm just on a mission to get in the best shape of my life and go get 24 hours worth of KTM tiers. And I think it's safe to say at this point that I cannot be stopped.